They lived together for 50 years, but after her death, he found a note from his wife and couldn't believe his eyes. The 72-year-old black man sat alone in his empty bedroom, staring at the old oak desk his wife had desperately pointed to with her dying breath. "What were you trying to tell me, Elizabeth?" he whispered to the silence. For 50 years, Marcus Johnson thought he knew everything about the white woman who had defied her racist father to marry him in 1973. They had built a beautiful life together, raised two successful children, and weathered every storm that America could throw at an interracial couple. But as Marcus opened the bottom drawer of that desk, his hands trembling, he discovered a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The return address made his blood run cold. Richard Collins, Birmingham, Michigan, Elizabeth's father, the man who had tried to destroy their love decades ago. What Marcus found in those letters would shatter everything he believed about his marriage, his family, and the woman he had loved for half a century. "Let me tell you something about love and lies, because Lord knows I thought I understood both until the day my wife died and left me holding secrets that could have burned our whole damn life to the ground. My name is Marcus Johnson, and for 50 years I believed I knew everything about the woman sleeping next to me. Hell, I was proud of knowing Elizabeth inside and out. Every freckle on her pale shoulders, every stubborn curl that refused to stay in place, every little sigh she made when she was thinking too hard about something. But as I sat there watching her take her last breath on that cold Detroit morning, I had no idea that the woman I'd loved for half a century had been carrying secrets that would make my head spin faster than a damn carnival ride. The rain was beating down on our old house like it had a personal grudge against the roof. Elizabeth had been fighting cancer for 8 months, and we both knew this day was coming. But knowing something's coming and being ready for it are two completely different things, especially when you're about to lose the only person who ever looked at a young black mechanic from the wrong side of town and saw husband material. I was holding her hand, watching her chest rise and fall in that shallow way that meant time was running out. Her skin was cold, almost translucent. Nothing like the warm, soft hands that used to trace patterns on my chest when we were young and thought the world couldn't touch us. Those hands had sewn countless school clothes for our kids, had patched up my cuts from the auto plant, had held mine through every storm life threw at us. "Liz, baby, I'm right here," I whispered, leaning close enough to smell that faint lavender scent she'd worn since our wedding day. Even dying, she smelled like home. She turned her head toward me, and for a second those blue eyes, the same ones that had looked past my dark skin to see the man underneath back in 1973, flickered with recognition. Her lips moved, trying to form words that wouldn't come. I could see the frustration in her face, the desperate need to tell me something important. "Don't strain yourself, sweetheart. Just rest," I said, smoothing back her gray hair, remembering when it was golden and caught the light like spun silk. But Elizabeth wasn't having it. She lifted one shaking hand and pointed toward the old oak desk in the corner of our bedroom. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach clench. Whatever she was trying to tell me about that desk, it was eating her alive. "What is it, Liz?" "What's over there?" She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left, looked at that desk one more time, then closed her eyes and never opened them again. At 3 in the morning, my wife of 50 years slipped away, taking with her whatever secret had been burning in her chest, and there I was, a 72-year-old man sitting in the dark, wondering what the hell she'd been trying to tell me about that damn desk. Now let me back up and tell you how we got here, because this story starts way before death came knocking. It starts back in 1973, when the world was still figuring out that love doesn't see color, even if most people were too stupid to understand it. I was 23, working as a mechanic at Henderson's Auto Repair on the east side of Detroit. The civil rights movement had been fought and supposedly won, but tried telling that to the white folks who still crossed the street when they saw me coming. I'd learned early that being a young black man meant you had to be twice as good and 3 times as careful if you wanted to survive in America. My daddy had been a factory worker at River Rouge, breaking his back for Ford Motor Company until the day he died at 58. My mama cleaned houses in the white suburbs, riding 3 buses each way to scrub toilets for women who wouldn't let her use their front door. I'd grown up watching them smile and say, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," to people who treated them like they were barely human, and I swore I'd find a better way. Cars were my escape. Engines didn't care what color my hands were. They either ran smooth or they didn't. Metal and gasoline and honest work. That's what made sense to me. I could take apart a transmission blindfolded and put it back together humming, and that skill kept food on my table and hope in my chest. The night I met Elizabeth, I was working late at the shop. Henderson had gone home hours earlier, but Mrs. Patterson's Buick was making a sound like a dying cat, and she needed it running for church the next morning. Mrs. Patterson was one of the few white customers who treated me with respect, always called me Mr. Johnson, and paid her bills on time. So when her granddaughter showed up at closing time with a broken-down Chevelle, I didn't have the heart to turn her away. Elizabeth Collins was 19 years old and looked like trouble wrapped in a summer dress. Auburn hair that caught the garage lights, blue eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a smile that could make a preacher forget his sermon. She was everything I'd been taught to avoid: young, white, and from the kind of family that had money and opinions about people like me. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," she said, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure she should come in. "My car just stopped running, and Grandma Patterson said you were the only mechanic in the city who could fix anything." I wiped my hands on my coveralls and tried not to stare at how the light made her hair shine like copper. "No trouble at all, miss. Let's take a look." She led me outside to a beat-up '69 Chevelle that had seen better decades. The engine was making a rattling sound that screamed, "Blown gasket," and I could smell burning oil from 20 feet away. "How long has it been making that noise?" I asked, popping the hood. "About a week," she said, then added with a sheepish grin, "Maybe 2 weeks. I kept hoping it would fix itself." I couldn't help but laugh. "Cars don't heal themselves, miss. They need a little help from people who speak their language." "And you speak car language?" "Fluent," I said, already diagnosing the problem. "Your head gasket's blown, and you've got oil leaking into places it shouldn't be. It's not cheap to fix, but it's not the end of the world either." She leaned against the car, watching me work in the dim light of the street lamp. Most white women would have stayed in their car or called someone to pick them up. But Elizabeth Collins stood there asking questions about engine compression and cooling systems like she actually cared about the answers. "You really love this, don't you?" she said after I'd spent 10 minutes explaining why her engine was basically choking on its own fluids. I looked up from the engine bay and found those blue eyes studying my face like I was something worth figuring out. "Love what?" "Fixing things. Making them work again." "I suppose I do," I said, feeling heat creep up my neck that had nothing to do with the summer air. There's something honest about mechanical work. A engine either runs or it doesn't. No bullshit, no politics, no pretending. Just truth. She smiled at that, and I felt something shift in my chest that I knew meant trouble. "I'm Elizabeth," she said, extending her hand. I looked at that pale hand hanging in the air between us and felt the weight of every warning I'd ever been given about white women and black men in America. But something in her eyes told me she wasn't offering that handshake to be polite. She was offering it because she wanted to touch me, and that realization hit me like a punch to the gut. "Marcus Johnson," I said, taking her hand in my oil-stained fingers. Her skin was soft and warm, and she held on just a second longer than necessary. In that moment, standing in the yellow light of a Detroit street lamp, with motor oil under my nails and a white girl's hand in mine, I felt the world tilt sideways. "Can you fix it?" she asked, and I wasn't entirely sure we were still talking about the car. "Yeah," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "I can fix it." And that's how it started, with a blown head gasket and a handshake that lasted too long. Two kids who should have known better, standing in a garage at 10 o'clock at night, pretending we didn't feel the electricity crackling between us like a live wire. Elizabeth came back the next evening to pick up her car. The repair had taken most of the day, but I'd stayed late to finish it, telling myself it was just good customer service. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about those blue eyes and that crooked smile. "She's purring like a kitten," I said, handing her the keys. "Should run smooth for years if you take care of her." "Thank you," she said, then hesitated. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Do you ever go to jazz clubs?" My heart started hammering against my ribs. This was dangerous territory. A white girl asking a black man about nightlife in 1973 Detroit. The smart thing would have been to make some excuse and send her on her way. Sometimes, I said instead, because apparently I was too stupid to live. There's this place called Blue Note, down on Cass Avenue. They have live music on Thursday nights. I knew Blue Note. It was one of the few clubs in the city where black and white folks mixed without anybody calling the cops. Still underground, still risky, but it existed. I know the place, I said carefully. I was thinking of going tomorrow night. If you know it, maybe you could show me around. I've never been to a real jazz club. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to say no. In 1973, a black man taking a white woman to a jazz club wasn't just breaking social rules. It was asking for trouble. The kind of trouble that could get you fired, beaten, or worse. But looking at Elizabeth Collins in that moment, with her hair catching the streetlight and her eyes holding mine without flinching, I realized I was already in trouble. Had been since the moment she walked into my garage. All right, I said, sealing both our fates. But you should know what you're getting into. People are going to stare. They're going to talk. Some of them might do more than talk. Let them stare, she said with a defiance that should have worried me more than it did. I'm not afraid of small minds. The next night, I picked her up 3 blocks from her house because we both knew her neighborhood wasn't ready for the sight of a black man knocking on doors after sunset. She was wearing a red dress that hugged her curves and made every man in Blue Note turn his head when we walked in. The club was packed, thick with cigarette smoke, and the kind of jazz that gets into your bones and stays there. We found a small table in the back, and I watched Elizabeth's face light up as the music washed over her. This is incredible, she said, leaning close so I could hear her over the trumpet solo. I had no idea music could feel like this. That's because you've been listening to the wrong music, I said, breathing in her perfume and trying not to think about how close she was sitting. We talked for hours, our conversation flowing easier than it had any right to. She told me about growing up in a house where dinner conversation was about stock portfolios and social standings. I told her about learning to fix cars in my uncle's backyard, while my parents worked double shifts to keep food on the table. Your family sounds loving, she said, and there was something wistful in her voice. They are. Your parents don't approve of you being here tonight, do they? She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. My parents don't approve of most things I do. They have very specific ideas about who I should be, who I should marry, what my life should look like. And what do you want your life to look like? She looked at me for a long moment, her blue eyes serious. Different, she said finally. I want it to look different from what they planned. That night ended with me walking her back to where I'd picked her up, our hands brushing as we talked. When we reached her corner, she turned to face me. Can we do this again? She asked. Elizabeth, I started, ready to give her all the reasons why this was insane. I know it's complicated, she said, cutting me off. I know people won't understand. But I don't care about people, Marcus. I care about you. Standing there under a streetlight in 1973 Detroit with a white woman telling me she cared about me, I felt like I was living in some kind of dream, the kind that felt too good to be real and too dangerous to last. Yeah, I said, throwing caution to the wind. We can do this again. And we did. For months we met in secret, at Blue Note, at coffee shops on the edge of town, sometimes just driving around the city in her Chevelle, talking about everything and nothing. We were careful, always looking over our shoulders, always aware that we were walking a tightrope that could snap at any moment. Elizabeth was unlike any woman I'd ever known. She was curious about my world, respectful of my experiences, and unafraid to challenge her own assumptions. When I told her about the subtle racism I faced every day, the way some customers wouldn't let me touch their cars, the cops who followed me through certain neighborhoods, the constant need to prove I belonged, she listened without trying to minimize it or explain it away. I'm sorry, she said one night as we sat in my old pickup truck, looking out at the Detroit River. I'm sorry you have to live with that. It's not your fault, I said. Maybe not directly, but I benefit from the same system that hurts you. That makes me complicit, doesn't it? I'd never heard a white person talk like that before. Most of them either pretended racism didn't exist or got defensive when you brought it up. Elizabeth just accepted it as truth and asked what she could do better. That's when I knew I was falling in love with her. Not just attracted to her, not just intrigued by her, in love. The kind of love that changes your whole world and makes you willing to fight for something that might be impossible. The trouble started on a Tuesday night in March. We'd been seeing each other for 6 months, and I'd started to believe we might actually have a chance. Love had made me stupid, I guess, because I suggested we go to a restaurant in her neighborhood instead of always hiding on my side of town. Marcus, I don't think that's a good idea, she said, worry creasing her forehead. Why not? We've been careful for months. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. It's not about hiding. It's about being smart. That neighborhood isn't ready for us. But I was feeling bold and tired of skulking around like we were doing something wrong. Love had made me brave and foolish in equal measure. Come on, Liz. We can't live in the shadows forever. So we went to Romano's, a little Italian place where her family had been eating for years. The hostess's face went through about 6 different expressions when she saw us together, finally settling on the kind of professional politeness that felt colder than outright hostility. We were seated at a table in the back corner, like we had some kind of contagious disease. I should have known then that we were walking into trouble, but I was too focused on Elizabeth's smile to pay attention to the warning signs. The trouble came in the form of 3 white men at the bar who'd been getting louder and drunker as the evening progressed. At first, it was just stares and whispered comments. Then one of them stumbled over to our table. "Excuse me," he said, his words slurred with alcohol and malice. "I think you might be lost, boy." I felt Elizabeth tense beside me, but I kept my voice calm. "We're just having dinner, sir. No trouble here." "No trouble?" The man laughed and his friends joined him. "A jigaboo in Romano's with a white woman, and you call that no trouble?" The restaurant had gone quiet. Every eye was on us, and I could feel the weight of their judgment like a physical thing. Some faces showed curiosity, others disapproval, and a few, God help them, showed the kind of hatred that had been killing black men for centuries. "I think you should go back to your own kind," the drunk man continued, loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear, "and leave decent white women alone." That's when Elizabeth stood up, her blue eyes blazing with a fury that could have melted steel. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent restaurant, "but I'm not a decoration or a prize to be protected. I'm a grown woman who can choose her own company, and I choose to have dinner with this gentleman, who has more class in his little finger than you have in your whole body." The drunk man's face turned red. "Lady, you don't know what you're saying. This boy is filling your head with—" "This man," Elizabeth said, emphasizing the word, "is my boyfriend, and if you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched 20 years of careful survival instincts war with my love for this brave, foolish woman who was willing to face down a room full of hostility for me. "Elizabeth," I said quietly, standing and putting my hand on her arm, "let's just go." But the drunk man wasn't done. "You think you're something special, don't you, boy? Think because you got yourself a white woman, you're equal to us?" That's when I made the mistake that changed everything. Instead of walking away, instead of being the bigger man, I looked that drunk fool in the eye and said, "I think I'm a man who's having dinner with a woman who loves him. If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why." The punch came fast, catching me on the jaw and sending me stumbling backward. But I'd been in fights before, and I knew how to handle myself. What I didn't know was how to handle what came next. Before I could even straighten up, the restaurant erupted. The drunk man's friends joined in, chairs started flying, and suddenly we were in the middle of a full-scale brawl. I fought back, protecting Elizabeth and trying to get us both out of there safely. That's when the cops showed up. 2 white officers burst through the door, took one look at the scene. White men on the ground, black man standing, white woman crying, and reached the conclusion that had been predetermined by 3 centuries of American history. "Hands behind your head now!" one of them shouted, pointing his gun at me. "Officer, this isn't what it looks like," Elizabeth said, stepping between us. "He was defending me. These men attacked us." But the cops weren't interested in her version of events. They were interested in the story that made sense to them. Angry black man attacks innocent white patrons in a nice restaurant. I ended up in handcuffs, facing charges of assault and disturbing the peace, while the men who started the fight walked away with sympathetic pats on the back from the responding officers. Elizabeth's father arrived at the police station 2 hours later, his face a mask of cold fury. Richard Collins was a man who commanded respect in this city, owned 3 successful businesses, sat on the school board, had the kind of connections that could make problems disappear or create them out of thin air. "Get my daughter away from this man," he told the desk sergeant, like I wasn't sitting right there in handcuffs. "Daddy, you don't understand," Elizabeth said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier fire. "I understand perfectly," Richard Collins said, his eyes never leaving my face. "This boy has filled your head with nonsense, taken advantage of your kindness, and now look where it's gotten you." I wanted to say something, to defend myself, to tell this man that I loved his daughter and would never hurt her. But I was learning a hard lesson about how the world worked. Sometimes it doesn't matter what you want to say. Sometimes all that matters is the color of your skin and the assumptions people make because of it. The charges were eventually dropped. Elizabeth's testimony and the restaurant's security camera footage made it clear who the real aggressors were. But the damage was done. Richard Collins used his influence to get me fired from Henderson's Auto Repair, and suddenly no other shop in the city would hire me. "It's nothing personal," Henderson told me when he handed me my final paycheck. "But Collins does a lot of business in this city. I can't afford to have him as an enemy." Elizabeth tried to fight for us. She argued with her father, defied his demands that she stop seeing me, even threatened to move out of the family home. But Richard Collins was a patient man who understood power and how to use it. He didn't just try to separate us, he tried to destroy me. Within a month, I couldn't find work anywhere in Detroit. My landlord, who had never had a problem with me before, suddenly decided I was too disruptive for his building. Even the bank where I'd had an account for 5 years closed it without explanation. "This is my fault," Elizabeth said one night as we sat in my truck, watching the lights of the city reflect off the river. "I should have listened when you said we should be careful." "No," I said, taking her hand. "You were right to stand up for us. I'm proud of you for that. But look what it's cost you. Your job, your apartment." "Jobs and apartments I can replace. You, I can't." She leaned against my shoulder, and I felt her tears soak through my shirt. "What are we going to do, Marcus?" "Daddy's not going to stop until he drives you out of the city." I'd been thinking about that same question for weeks, and I'd come to a conclusion that scared me more than Richard Collins' threats. "We leave," I said. "Pack up and go somewhere new, somewhere we can start over." Elizabeth was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. "Are you asking me to run away with you?" "I'm asking you to build a life with me, somewhere else where your father's influence can't reach us. And if I say yes, if I leave everything I've ever known," I turned to face her, cupping her face in my hands, "then we'll make our own family, our own home, our own rules. It won't be easy, but it'll be ours." Elizabeth looked into my eyes for what felt like forever. I could see her weighing everything. Her family's wealth and status against an uncertain future with me. The comfort of her old life against the possibility of something real and honest and true. "Yes," she whispered finally. "Yes, I'll go with you." 2 weeks later, we were on a Greyhound bus heading north to Chicago, carrying everything we owned in 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. Elizabeth had left a letter for her parents explaining her decision and asking them to understand. She'd also left behind her trust fund, her inheritance, and every material comfort she'd ever known. "Any regrets?" I asked as Detroit disappeared behind us. She took my hand and smiled. "Only that we waited so long to do this." We got married 3 days after arriving in Chicago, in a small church where the pastor didn't care about the color of our skin, only about the love in our hearts. Elizabeth wore a simple white dress from a thrift store, and I wore the only suit I owned. We had no family, no friends, no money to speak of. But we had each other, and in that moment, it felt like enough. Chicago in 1974 was better than Detroit, but not by much. We found a tiny apartment in a mixed neighborhood where interracial couples weren't unheard of, though they still drew stares and whispers. I got work at a construction site, and Elizabeth found a job teaching at an inner-city elementary school. The first few years were hard, really hard. We lived paycheck to paycheck, eating beans and rice more nights than I care to remember. Elizabeth's hands, which had never known manual labor, became rough and calloused from washing clothes by hand and scrubbing floors. My back ached from hauling steel and concrete 12 hours a day. But we were happy. Christ, we were happy. We'd lie in our narrow bed at night, planning for the future and dreaming about the children we'd have someday. Elizabeth would trace patterns on my chest and tell me about her students, how they'd started calling her Miss Liz and drawing her pictures of their families. "I want our kids to feel proud of who they are," she said one night, "proud of both sides of their heritage." "They will," I promised. "We'll make sure of it." Our first child, Michael, was born in 1976. The moment I held my son, this perfect little person who was part me and part Elizabeth, I understood what people meant when they talked about love changing everything. He was beautiful, with caramel skin and Elizabeth's blue eyes, and I swore I'd never let anyone make him feel ashamed of who he was. Sarah came along 2 years later, just as perfect and just as loved. Watching Elizabeth with our children was like watching magic happen. She'd sing to them in the evenings, read them stories about brave children who looked like them, and always made sure they knew they were wanted and cherished. The years passed and slowly things got easier. I worked my way up from construction to becoming a foreman, then started my own small contracting business. Elizabeth continued teaching, eventually becoming a principal at her school. We bought a little house with a yard where the kids could play, saved money for their college educations, and built the kind of life that would have seemed impossible back in 1973. But Elizabeth never talked about her family. In all our years together, she never mentioned wanting to contact her parents or wondering how they were doing. When the kids asked about their white grandparents, she'd get quiet and change the subject. I figured it was her way of protecting herself from old pain, so I never pushed. What I didn't know was that Elizabeth had been carrying secrets all these years. Secrets that would have changed everything if I'd known about them. Secrets about money, about family, about a past that was more complicated than she'd ever let on. As I sat there that morning, watching the rain streak down our bedroom windows and holding the hand of the woman who'd shared my life for 50 years, I thought I knew everything there was to know about Elizabeth Collins Johnson. I was wrong about that too. Elizabeth died at 3:17 a.m., slipping away so quietly I almost missed it. One moment she was breathing, the next she wasn't. Just like that, half a century of shared life came to an end. I sat with her until sunrise, memorizing her face and trying to understand what she'd been trying to tell me about that desk. Whatever secret she'd been carrying, whatever she'd wanted me to know, died with her. Or so I thought. We've only just started this story, but trust me, it's about to get a whole lot more intense. Stick around to find out what happens when our hero faces even greater injustice. Part 2. Buried Secrets. The funeral home took Elizabeth's body the next morning, and suddenly I was alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. 50 years of shared life, and now every room echoed with memories that seemed to mock me. The coffee cup she'd used the morning before still sat in the sink. Her reading glasses were folded on the nightstand next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. It was like she'd just stepped out for groceries and would be back any minute, with that crooked smile and some story about the neighbors. But Elizabeth wasn't coming back, and that damn desk was still sitting in the corner, holding whatever secret had been eating at her in those final moments. I'd been putting off looking through her things, telling myself I needed time to grieve. The truth was, I was scared. Scared of what I might find, scared of learning that the woman I'd loved for half a century had been a stranger. After watching her point at that desk with such desperate urgency, I knew whatever was in there wasn't going to be pleasant. It took me 3 days to work up the courage. I started with the obvious places. The top drawer where she kept her checkbook and household bills. Nothing unusual there, just the normal paperwork of a life lived responsibly. Insurance documents, utility bills, a few birthday cards from the grandkids. The kind of mundane stuff that accumulates when you stay in one place long enough to call it home. The second drawer held her teaching supplies, old lesson plans, student photos, Thank you notes from parents whose kids she'd helped over the years. Elizabeth had taught third grade for 30 years before retiring, and she'd kept every single drawing, every crooked thank you card, every photo from classroom parties. Looking at those smiling faces, I remembered how she used to come home excited about some breakthrough with a struggling student, or frustrated because the school district didn't have funding for books that weren't falling apart. It was in the bottom drawer that I found the first crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew. Hidden under a stack of old Christmas cards was a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The return address made my blood run cold. Richard Collins, Birmingham, Michigan. Elizabeth's father. The man who'd tried to destroy my life 50 years ago, who'd driven us out of Detroit with his hatred and his power. The man Elizabeth told me she'd never spoken to again after we ran away together. My hands were shaking as I untied that ribbon. The first letter was dated December 15, 1975, just 2 years after we'd left Detroit, right around the time Michael was born. My dearest Elizabeth, it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment because the words were swimming in front of my eyes. I know I have no right to contact you after everything that happened, but I cannot let another Christmas pass without trying to reach out to my daughter. I was wrong, Elizabeth. Terribly, unforgivably wrong about many things. I sat down hard in the old leather chair next to the desk, the letter trembling in my hands. Elizabeth had been getting letters from her father for decades, and she'd never said a word. I heard through mutual acquaintances that you had a baby boy, my grandson. I lie awake at night wondering what he looks like, if he has your stubborn chin or your mother's blue eyes. I wonder if you tell him stories about his grandfather, or if I've been erased from his life entirely. The letter went on, and with each line, I felt like someone was taking a sledgehammer to my chest. Richard Collins wasn't the monster we'd run from, or at least, he wasn't just a monster. He was a man who'd made terrible choices and was living with the consequences. Your mother misses you desperately. She hasn't said your name out loud since you left, but I find her sometimes sitting in your old room, holding the quilt she made for your wedding trousseau. The wedding we never got to see, to the man we never got to know. I set that letter aside and picked up the next one, dated 6 months later. Then another and another. A paper trail of longing and regret that stretched across decades. Richard Collins writing about his health problems, about Elizabeth's mother's declining memory, about the business he was building, and the grandchildren he'd never meet. And Elizabeth had been writing back. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut when I found copies of her letters, written in her careful teacher's handwriting, tucked between her father's correspondence. Dear Daddy, one of them began, thank you for the photograph of you and Mama at Christmas. You both look older, but happy. I'm glad to know that Mama's memory problems aren't getting worse. Another letter from 1982. Michael is 7 now, and he's everything you'd want in a grandson. Smart as a whip, curious about everything, and kind to his bones. Marcus has been teaching him about cars, and he can already change oil and check tire pressure. You'd be proud of him, Daddy. You'd be proud of both our children. Elizabeth had been sharing our life with her father for decades. Our children's milestones, our struggles and successes, the intimate details of the family we'd built together. And she'd never told me. I kept reading, watching our marriage unfold through Elizabeth's letters to a man I thought we'd left behind forever. She wrote about Michael's graduation from high school, Sarah's acceptance to medical school, the pride in her voice jumping off the page as she described our children's achievements. But it was a letter from 1987 that made me understand the true scope of what Elizabeth had been hiding from me. Daddy, I know you're sick, and I know you're worried about what will happen to your estate when you're gone. Marcus and I have built a good life here, but money is still tight. Michael wants to go to engineering school, and Sarah has her heart set on becoming a doctor. The scholarships will help, but it won't cover everything. The next letter in the sequence was from Richard Collins, and it changed everything. Elizabeth, I've revised my will. Everything, the house, the businesses, the investments, it's all going to you. You're my only child, my only heir, and despite our differences, you deserve what I've built. The lawyers will contact you when the time comes. Richard Collins had died in November 1987. I remembered that month clearly because Elizabeth had seemed distracted, almost depressed around Thanksgiving. When I'd asked her what was wrong, she blamed it on the changing weather, said she always got melancholy when winter set in. What she didn't tell me was that she'd inherited close to $2 million. I found the bank statements hidden in an envelope marked household records. Account after account, investment after investment, all in Elizabeth's name. Money that had been quietly funding our life for over 30 years. The house we'd bought in 1988, the one where we'd raised our children and grown old together. Elizabeth's inheritance had paid for it. Michael's engineering degree, Sarah's medical school, the family vacations we'd taken, the comfortable retirement we'd enjoyed. It had all been funded by money from the man who'd once tried to destroy us. And Elizabeth had never said a word. I felt like I was drowning. Everything I'd believed about our life, about our struggles and our triumphs, was built on a lie. All those years I'd worked myself to the bone, proud that I was providing for my family through honest labor. Elizabeth had been sitting on a fortune that could have made our lives immeasurably easier. Why hadn't she told me? Was she ashamed of taking money from her father? Did she think I was too proud to accept it? Or was there something else, some other secret she'd been protecting? That's when I found the second bundle of letters, tied with a red ribbon and hidden at the very back of the drawer. These weren't from Richard Collins. The return address read, Mercy General Hospital, Detroit, Michigan, and the dates went all the way back to 1972, a year before Elizabeth and I had even met. The first letter was addressed to Miss Elizabeth Collins and marked confidential. Dear Miss Collins, we are writing to inform you that the child you delivered on March 15, 1972, was successfully placed with an adoptive family. Per your father's instructions, all records of the birth have been sealed, and the adoptive parents have been instructed not to attempt contact. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. Elizabeth had had a baby before we met, a child she'd given up for adoption, a secret she'd carried for her entire adult life. The next letter provided more details. The adoptive family has been thoroughly screened and approved. They are a professional couple from Chicago, unable to have children of their own. They have agreed to provide annual updates on the child's welfare through our social services department. Chicago, the city where we'd run to start our new life. Had Elizabeth chosen it because that's where her first child was living? I kept reading, my hands shaking with each new revelation. Annual reports about a boy named David Harrison, adopted at birth and raised by loving parents. School photos showing a child who looked nothing like Elizabeth, but had her stubborn chin and intelligent eyes. Report cards and achievement awards and letters from his adoptive parents describing a happy, healthy, successful kid. Elizabeth had been getting updates on her first child for decades, watching him grow up from a distance while raising the children we'd had together. The report stopped in 1990 when David turned 18 and the legal obligation for updates ended. But there was one more letter in the bundle, dated just 3 months ago. Mrs. Johnson, it began, and seeing Elizabeth's married name in that context made my chest tighten. My name is David Harrison, and I believe you are my biological mother. I've been searching for you for several years, and I finally obtained your contact information through a private investigator. I had to stop reading and pour myself a drink. Whiskey, neat, the kind of drink that burns away confusion and leaves you with nothing but brutal clarity. Elizabeth's first son had found her, and based on the date of the letter, she'd known about it for months before she died. I went back to the letter, steeling myself for whatever came next. I want you to know that I had a wonderful childhood with my adoptive parents, and I'm not looking to disrupt your life or cause any problems. I'm married with 2 children of my own, and I live a good life here in Chicago. But I've always wondered about my biological family, and now that my adoptive parents have both passed away, I felt free to pursue those questions. The letter was respectful, carefully worded, clearly written by someone who understood the delicate nature of his inquiry. But reading it felt like being slowly crushed under the weight of everything Elizabeth had never told me. I've enclosed my contact information, and I hope you'll consider meeting with me. I don't want anything from you except the chance to know something about where I came from. If you'd prefer not to have contact, I'll respect that decision and won't bother you again. At the bottom of the letter was a phone number and an address. David Harrison lived less than 50 miles from where we'd spent the last 4 decades of our lives, and I'd never known he existed. But Elizabeth had known. For 3 months, she'd known her first child was reaching out to her, and she'd said nothing. I found her response in the same bundle, a copy she'd apparently kept for herself. Dear David, receiving your letter was both a shock and a blessing. I've thought about you every day for the past 47 years, wondering what kind of person you'd become and whether you were happy. She'd met with him. According to her letter, they'd had coffee at a diner in downtown Chicago just 2 weeks before she'd gotten her cancer diagnosis. You're everything I hoped you'd be: kind, intelligent, successful, and clearly loved by the family you've built. Seeing you was like getting a glimpse of the road not taken, and I'm grateful beyond words that you sought me out. But even in that letter, Elizabeth had lied. She'd told David she was a widow, that his biological father had died years earlier. She'd never mentioned me, never said anything about the half-brother and half-sister he had, living just a few hours away. Why? Why keep lying, even to the son she'd given up and thought about every day for decades? The answer came in the final letter in the bundle, one I almost missed because it was folded so small and wedged so far back in the drawer. It wasn't addressed to anyone, wasn't signed, wasn't dated. Just Elizabeth's handwriting on a piece of notebook paper, like she'd been trying to work out her thoughts on paper. How do I tell Marcus that I had a child before we met? How do I explain that I've been in contact with my father all these years, that I used his money to build our life? How do I admit that David exists without destroying everything we built together? Marcus is a proud man, a good man who's worked his whole life to provide for his family. If he knew that I've been living on my father's money, if he knew that our comfortable life was bought with blood money from the man who tried to destroy him, it would kill him. And what about Michael and Sarah? They have a half-brother they've never heard of, living less than an hour away. They deserve to know about David. But how do I explain keeping this secret for so long? I've made so many mistakes, kept so many secrets. I told myself I was protecting my family. But maybe I was just protecting myself. Maybe I was just too much of a coward to face the truth about who I really am. David wants to meet his biological father. He keeps asking about Marcus in his letters, and I keep making excuses. I've told him his father died before he was born, but that lie gets harder to maintain every time we meet. I'm running out of time. The cancer is getting worse, and soon I won't be able to hide it anymore. I need to tell Marcus everything before I die, but I don't know how. I don't know how to look at the man I've loved for 50 years and admit that everything he believes about our life together is built on lies. The paper was smudged in places, like Elizabeth had been crying while she wrote it. I sat there in that chair, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd believed about my marriage, and tried to figure out what I was supposed to feel. Anger, betrayal, hurt. All of those emotions were there, swirling around in my chest like a hurricane. But underneath it all was something else, a deep, aching sadness for the woman who'd carried these secrets alone for so long. Elizabeth had been protecting me, protecting our children, protecting the life we'd built together. But she'd also been slowly destroying herself with the weight of her lies. My phone rang, jarring me out of my thoughts. The caller ID showed Michael's number. "Hey, Dad, how are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I said, my voice hoarser than I'd expected. "Sarah and I were thinking we'd come over this weekend to help you go through Mom's things. I know it's hard to do alone." I looked at the letters scattered across the desk, at the evidence of 50 years of secrets and lies. "Actually, son, I think I need to handle this myself. There are some private matters I need to sort through first. Dad, you don't have to protect us from grief. We want to help. I know you do, and I appreciate it, but this is something I need to do." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of that house and tried to figure out what came next. Elizabeth was gone, taking with her any chance I'd ever have to understand why she'd kept these secrets. But David Harrison was still out there, still wondering about his biological family, still believing his father was dead. I had his phone number. I had his address. I had the power to either keep Elizabeth's lies alive or to shatter them with the truth. What I didn't have was any idea which choice was right. The sun was setting by the time I worked up the courage to pick up the phone. I dialed David's number 3 times and hung up before it could ring. On the fourth try, I let it connect. Hello? The voice was young, confident, professional. Is this David Harrison? Yes, it is. Who's calling? I took a deep breath and jumped off the cliff Elizabeth had been afraid to approach. My name is Marcus Johnson. I think we need to talk. We're on the brink of the climax. What happens next will turn everything upside down. You simply can't miss the resolution of this story. Part 3, The Final Revelation. The silence on the other end of that phone line stretched out like a lifetime. I could hear David breathing, could almost feel his confusion radiating through the connection. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled, like a man who'd learned to guard his words. I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone named Marcus Johnson. Are you sure you have the right number? Your biological mother was Elizabeth Collins. She married me in 1974 and became Elizabeth Johnson. We lived together for 50 years until she died 4 days ago. Another long silence, then, that's impossible. Elizabeth told me her husband died years ago. Elizabeth told you a lot of things that weren't true, son, and we need to talk about that. I heard him take a shaky breath. I don't understand. Why would she lie about something like that? Because your mother spent 50 years protecting people from truths she thought would hurt them, including me, including you. Can you meet me tomorrow? There are things you need to know about your family, your real family. David agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, halfway between our two worlds. I spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to explain 50 years of lies to a man who'd been searching for truth his whole life. The next morning, I put on my best suit, the same one I'd worn to Elizabeth's funeral, and drove into the city. Chicago in November was gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. The coffee shop David had chosen was one of those trendy places with exposed brick walls and coffee that cost more than I used to make in an hour back when I was swinging a hammer for a living. I spotted him immediately when I walked in. Elizabeth hadn't been kidding when she'd said he looked like me. Same broad shoulders, same way of holding his head when he was thinking. But his skin was lighter, his features softer, and his clothes spoke of a professional life I'd never lived. This was a man who'd grown up with advantages, who'd never had to fight for respect or prove he belonged in a room. David, I said, approaching his table. He stood up, and I could see him studying my face, looking for some resemblance, some proof that I was telling the truth. Mr. Johnson? Just Marcus, I said, sitting down across from him. We're family, after all. Are we? His voice was polite but skeptical. Because 48 hours ago, I thought my biological father was dead. Now you're sitting here telling me that my mother lied about one of the most basic facts of my existence? I couldn't argue with that. Your mother lied about a lot of things, David. But not because she was a bad person. Because she was scared. Scared of what? Scared of losing the people she loved. Scared of the truth about who she really was. I spent the next hour telling David everything I'd learned from those letters. About Elizabeth's secret correspondence with her father, about the inheritance she'd hidden from me, about the months of meetings they'd had while I remained oblivious. With each revelation, I watched his face change, watched him process the reality that the woman he'd thought he was getting to know had been playing a role even with him. So everything she told me about her life was a lie? He asked when I finished. Not everything. She really did love you. She really did think about you every day for 47 years. But yes, most of it was lies. David leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. Why didn't she just tell the truth? Why make it so complicated? Because the truth was complicated, son. Your mother got pregnant when she was 16, by a white boy from her neighborhood. Her father made her give you up, told her you were dead, erased you from her life completely. By the time she found out you were alive and well, she was married to me with 2 other kids. How do you explain something like that to a family? You could have handled it. You seem like you're handling it now. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Am I? David, I found out 4 days ago that my wife of 50 years had been lying to me about fundamental parts of her life. I found out that the comfortable life we built together was funded by money from a man who tried to destroy me. I found out that my children have a half-brother they've never met, living 50 miles away. I'm not handling anything. I'm barely keeping my head above water. But you called me anyway. Yeah, I called you anyway, because you deserve the truth, even if it's ugly. Especially if it's ugly. David was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like it might hold answers. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. I have a half-brother and half-sister. Michael and Sarah, both grown, both successful, both completely unaware that you exist. Jesus. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What are you going to tell them? The truth? All of it. They deserve to know about you, just like you deserve to know about them. And what if they don't want to know me? What if they blame me for their mother's lies? I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm. Son, I've spent the last 4 days being angry at your mother for keeping secrets. But sitting here with you now, I understand why she did it. You're a good man. Anyone can see that. Michael and Sarah are going to love you, just like I already do. That broke him. David put his head in his hands and cried like a man who'd been holding back tears for 47 years. I sat there and let him grieve for the mother he'd lost before he'd really found her, for the family that had been stolen from him by well-meaning lies. When he finally composed himself, he looked at me with Elizabeth's eyes. What happens now? Now we stop living Elizabeth's lies and start living our truth. I call my kids and tell them about their brother. You decide if you want to be part of this family or if it's too complicated, too painful. Of course I want to be part of it, he said immediately. I've been looking for my family my whole life. Even though we're not what you expected, even though your sister's a doctor and your brother is an engineer, but your father is just an old construction worker with calloused hands and a high school education? David smiled for the first time since I'd sat down. Marcus, I was raised by a postal worker and a school secretary. I know the value of honest work and good people. Beside, he added, grinning wider, you're the man who loved my mother enough to build a life with her when the whole world was against you. That makes you pretty heroic in my book. I felt something loosen in my chest, some knot of anger and betrayal that had been choking me since I'd found those letters. There's something else, I said, pulling an envelope from my jacket pocket. I found this hidden with all the other letters. It's addressed to me in your mother's handwriting. I think she wanted me to find it after she died. I'd been carrying that envelope around since yesterday, afraid to open it, afraid of what final secrets it might contain. But sitting here with David, feeling like maybe we could build something real out of the wreckage of Elizabeth's lies, I finally felt ready. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Elizabeth died, written in the shaky handwriting of someone whose body was failing, but whose mind was still sharp. My dearest Marcus, it began, if you're reading this, then you found all my secrets and you probably hate me right now. I don't blame you. I've been a coward, and that cowardice has hurt everyone I love. I read the letter silently first, then looked up at David. She wrote this for both of us, I think. Do you want me to read it out loud? He nodded. I need you to understand why I kept David's existence a secret for so long. When I met you, I was running from everything my old life represented. The privilege, the prejudice, the pain of losing my first child. You represented something pure and honest and real, and I was terrified that if you knew about my past, you'd see me as damaged goods. As the years went by, it became harder and harder to find the right time to tell you. How do you explain to your husband that you've been hiding a child? How do you tell your children they have a brother you've never mentioned? I convinced myself that I was protecting everyone, but really I was protecting myself from having to face what I'd done. When Daddy started writing to me, I should have told you. When he died and left us that money, I should have told you. When David found me, I definitely should have told you. But I was selfish and scared, and I let those feelings rule my choices. Marcus, I need you to know that every penny of Daddy's money went to our family. Michael's education, Sarah's medical school, the house where we raised our babies. It was all paid for with money that should have been blood money, but became love money instead. I used my father's wealth to build the life he tried to take away from us. There's a justice in that, even if it came at the cost of honesty. David is a wonderful man, Marcus. He's kind and smart, and everything I hoped he would become. He has your strength and your integrity, even though you never raised him. That tells me something about the power of genetics, about the way good character runs in families. I've made arrangements for you to inherit everything when I die. The house, the investments, all of it. But more importantly, I'm leaving you with the truth about David. He's your son now, just as much as Michael and Sarah are your children. Love him the way you loved me, not because he's perfect, but because he's family. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I'm asking you to forgive me for being human, for being flawed, for letting fear make my choices instead of love, and I'm asking you to help David forgive me too. Tell our children about their brother. Tell them that their mother wasn't perfect, but that she loved them enough to make hard choices, even when those choices were wrong. Tell them that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people you choose to love and fight for and stand by, no matter what. Thank you for 50 years of love, Marcus. Thank you for seeing past my skin color to the woman underneath. Thank you for building a life with me when the world said it was impossible. And thank you for being the kind of man who will do right by David, even after I'm gone. All my love, always and forever, Elizabeth P.S. Tell David that I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell him the truth while I was alive. Tell him that having to give him up was the hardest thing I ever did, and that not a day went by that I didn't wonder what kind of man he would become. Tell him I'm proud of him, and that his father, his real father, the one who's reading this letter, will be proud of him too. By the time I finished reading, both David and I were crying openly. The coffee shop around us had filled up with the lunch crowd, but we sat in our little bubble of grief and revelation. Two men trying to figure out how to move forward from 50 years of well-intentioned lies. She forgave herself in the end, David said quietly. That's something, I guess. And she asked us to forgive her too. Can you? After everything she kept from you? I thought about that question, really thought about it. Could I forgive Elizabeth for building our life on secrets? Could I forgive her for letting me believe I was providing for my family through my own hard work when she had millions sitting in hidden accounts? Could I forgive her for denying me the chance to know my stepson for 47 years? Yeah, I said finally. I can forgive her, because sitting here with you, knowing that she brought you back into our lives, even if she did it the hard way, I can see that everything she did was about love. Misguided, complicated, sometimes selfish love, but love all the same. David smiled through his tears. So, what now? How do we tell Michael and Sarah about me? Carefully, I said. Honestly. Together. I called Michael first, then Sarah, asking them both to come to the house that evening for an important family discussion. I didn't tell them what it was about, just that there were things about their mother they needed to know. When they arrived, I sat them down in the living room, where Elizabeth and I had spent countless evenings watching TV and helping with homework and planning for the future. David had driven down from Chicago and was waiting in the kitchen, as nervous as a teenager meeting his girlfriend's parents for the first time. What's this about, Dad? Sarah asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. In a way, I have, I said. Kids, your mother kept some secrets from us, important secrets. And now that she's gone, it's time you knew the truth about our family. I told them everything, just like I told David, about the letters from their grandfather, about the hidden inheritance, about the brother they'd never known existed. I watched their faces change as the story unfolded, watched them process the reality that their mother had been carrying these secrets their entire lives. When I finished, Michael was the first to speak. So we have a brother, he said, his voice filled with wonder rather than anger. His name is David Harrison. He's 47 years old. He's married with 2 kids of his own, and he's sitting in our kitchen right now wondering if you're going to want to meet him. Sarah stood up immediately. What are we waiting for? The reunion that followed was everything Elizabeth could have hoped for and nothing she could have imagined. Michael and Sarah embraced David like they'd been missing him their whole lives, which in a way they had been. They peppered him with questions about his life, his family, his childhood, hungry for details about the brother they'd never known existed. David showed them pictures of his wife and children, told them about his work as a high school history teacher, shared stories about the parents who'd raised him with love and kindness. In return, Michael and Sarah shared their own stories, filling David in on 47 years of family history he'd missed. Mom would have loved this, Sarah said as we all sat around the kitchen table, looking at photo albums and sharing memories. She always said family was the most important thing in the world. She was right, David said. She just had a complicated way of showing it. As the evening wore on, I found myself watching my three children, because that's what they were now, all three of them mine, and feeling a peace I hadn't experienced since Elizabeth died. She'd been wrong to keep secrets, wrong to let fear guide her choices, but she'd been right about one thing. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people you chose to love and stand by, no matter how complicated the circumstances. There's one more thing, I said as the evening was winding down. Your mother left money, a lot of money, enough to pay for your kids' college educations, enough to set up trust funds, enough to make sure this family never has to worry about financial security again. Dad, we don't need, Michael started. I know you don't need it, I said, but she wanted you to have it. All of you, I added, looking at David. She made provisions for you too, son. She wanted to make sure you were included in everything. David shook his head. I don't want her money. I just want my family. You've got your family, I said. The money's just a bonus. Later that night, after Michael and Sarah had gone home and David had driven back to Chicago with promises to return the following weekend, I sat alone in the house that had been my home for 30 years. Elizabeth's presence was everywhere, in the photos on the walls, in the books on the shelves, in the way the furniture was arranged just so. But for the first time since she died, the house didn't feel haunted by secrets. It felt like home again. I walked into the bedroom and looked at the desk where I'd found all those letters, all those revelations that had turned my world upside down. Tomorrow I'd start the process of legally adopting David as my son, making official what had become true in my heart. I'd work with lawyers to distribute Elizabeth's inheritance fairly among all three of my children. I'd begin the long process of integrating our expanded family into one cohesive unit. But tonight, I just wanted to remember the good parts. Elizabeth young and beautiful in that red dress at Blue Note. Elizabeth holding our babies and singing lullabies. Elizabeth growing old beside me, her hair going gray, her hands growing soft with age, her love never wavering even when her secrets were eating her alive. I pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. Dear Elizabeth, I began, I found your letter. I found all your letters, and I want you to know that I understand now why you kept those secrets. I don't agree with your choices, but I understand them. I met our son today, your first son, the one you never stopped loving even though you had to let him go. He's a good man, Liz. He's got your eyes and your stubborn streak, but he's also got something else. Something that tells me he would have loved you just as much as Michael and Sarah do. Secrets and all. David's part of our family now. Our kids accept him, love him, want him around for holidays and birthdays and all the ordinary moments that make up a life. You did that, Liz. Even with all your mistakes, even with all your lies, you brought him back to us. You gave us the gift of completeness. I forgive you for the secrets. I forgive you for the money. I forgive you for being human and flawed and scared. But mostly I forgive you for loving us all so much that you were willing to carry the weight of those secrets alone for 50 years. You were wrong about one thing, though. You thought the truth would destroy our family. Instead, it's made us stronger. It's made us whole. Rest easy, my love. Your family is together at last. All my love, always and forever, Marcus. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer with all the others. Tomorrow I'd start living in the truth Elizabeth had been too scared to face. Tonight, I'd just be grateful for the love that had carried us through 50 years of secrets and brought us home to each other in the end. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. I thought about Elizabeth pointing to that desk with her last bit of strength, making sure I'd find the truth she'd been too afraid to speak out loud. She'd been protecting us one last time, in her own complicated way. Making sure we'd have each other after she was gone, making sure her secrets would become the foundation for something stronger and more honest than what we'd had before. Family, I realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about forgiveness. It was about choosing to love people despite their flaws, because of their humanity, through all the messy complications that make up a real life. Elizabeth had taught me that in the end, not through her words, but through her choices, not through her perfection, but through her mistakes. And that, I thought, as I turned off the lights and headed to bed, was the greatest gift she could have given us all.